edition of Video Inc. My name is Greg Norman. It is Tuesday, November 15th, 2016. For those of you who are not aware, it's opening of hunting season here in Michigan. And we're lucky enough to have with us for a guest today, David Trent, who is the new Village of Ortonville Village Manager. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
You've been on the job a couple of weeks, I think, 3?
Almost a month now.
Almost a month. We wanted to have a chance to maybe chat and learn a little bit about David, Mr. Trent, obviously. And so I guess maybe start with, where are you coming from to come to Ortonville?
Well, I currently live in Salem Township, which is in the northeast corner of Washtenaw County. We're about 15 miles from Ann Arbor. And as the crow flies, it's 42.2 miles from my doorstep to the village offices. However, some folks in my early jaunts up here had pity on me because of the route I was taking coming up through M5 and through Clarkston. And somebody suggested, have you considered coming up 23?
Across the Fenton.
And across Fenton on Grange Hall Road, which takes you right into the heart of the village here. So I tried that route. It adds about 10 miles to my travels, but it's actually cutting about 20 to 30 minutes out of my travel time because of fewer red lights and less traffic. So it's working out much better.
A lot less traffic.
Yes.
Having grown up in Fenton, I know this route, north, east, and west from that perspective. Now, you retired. Before you took the job, maybe talk a little bit about your background.
Well, I currently am on our Salem Township Board. I've been involved in our local government for 12 years, 2 terms as a clerk, 1 term as a trustee here the last 4 years, and just last week I was reelected to that trustee position, so I have another 4-year term that I can finish. And really enjoy the world of government, utilizing my managerial and quality engineering skills to the world of government operations. Speaking of quality engineering, I started out my career path as a GM guy. I worked for the old hydromatic plant, which got incorporated into GM Powertrain down in Ypsilanti. That plant is now closed. But I got involved as an hourly employee, went through their supervisor's training school that they used to have back in the day.
GMI?
Well, not GMI, but an in-house supervisor's training. Okay. And became a quality control supervisor. And through that, and with some organizational changes, the GM upper executives realizing after a period of time that our friendly Japanese competition was about 4 times better than what we were when it came to warranty issues, created some small troubleshooting teams. And I was fortunate enough to be selected to be part of one of those groups. And along the course of time, I ended up getting a couple of promotions and left GM in the early 90s as a quality group manager, where I had oversight responsibilities for one of our product lines at the plant.
General Motors and small government there was some correlation there, so maybe that's where part of that came through. There's a lot of the same, because obviously the corporate world of General Motors was certainly stacked with levels of operation.
Yes, it was, and one of my functions at GM was I was part of what they called a product team. And it had representatives from each facet of the organization. And in the role that I had, where I reported directly to the product team leader or champion of the group, it gave me the opportunity and flexibility to essentially walk the entire plant and interface with every representative in the organization. And at the same time, I was going to school at Eastern Michigan for my bachelor's degree in business. And so it really provided a nice dovetailing of taking what I learned in the classroom and apply it to a real world situation in a big organization like GM. And also with other groups that I was part of, nonprofit groups and so on, it really gave me a good hands-on understanding of how organizations function, trying to bring people together for a successful mission. And so when I got involved with my local government, it was just another transition, bringing those principles of management and organization together to provide good government service.
You mentioned about a dozen years or so being involved in local government, so you kind of came to local government later in life?
Yes, just 12 years ago. I've always had an interest in government.
What got you, what was the bug?
Well, that's a great question, Greg. When I was was 19 years old. I was going to school at Schoolcraft College for my associate's degree. I graduated from Plymouth High back in 1971. And just the right combination of good professors, getting serious about life, if you will, and the light bulb seemed to come on, and I got very interested in government and decided to run for school board as a 19-year-old kid. I lost, but it was a great learning experience because it gave me the opportunity to meet people in the community,
right,
business leaders, people that were willing to take me under their wing and mentor me. And from that, being involved in a candidates forum that was sponsored by the Plymouth JCs, I got invited after the campaign was over to become part of the local Plymouth JC chapter. And a lot of people that are familiar with the JCs know that their motto is developing leadership through community involvement.
Yep.
And so I became a very active participant in the JCs, became part of their local board of directors, became vice president of the organization. And so that involvement from that standpoint helped me as far as a foundation of understanding leadership principles, skills, management, interfacing with people to get things done.
And in that time frame, in those years, I'm about 12 months younger than you, so I remember living in that era. Having somebody 19 or 20 years old going for a government position, elected position, was pretty unusual, despite the activity that we were involved in politically with the war and all the other kinds of things. That was, you were taking, I mean, that was not typical for that age, in that era.
I would concur with that. In fact, right around that time frame, you'll recall, is when the law was changed to allow 18-year-olds the opportunity to vote.
And drink.
Yeah. And I took that very seriously. I haven't missed one election during my lifetime. And I just think having the opportunity to exercise your right to vote in those types of political opportunities is something that should not be taken lightly. And there's an old adage that's been said that once you run for political office, sometimes it puts a fire in your belly that doesn't get extinguished until you actually run and win. And I've always had an interest in politics, in local government, considered running for other positions over the course of time, and was always involved as a precinct delegate from the late 70s. But you know, the opportunities just happened to work out where when I moved to Salem Township, I did run for state representative in my district. I was actually just contacting the local political chapter out there to find out when the deadline was to file as a precinct delegate, because I was moving from Wayne County to Washtenaw County.
Right.
And then I said, well, you know, tell me who's running for such and such spots out in my neck of the woods, because I'm not familiar with who the folks are. And in that conversation, discovered that there wasn't anybody running for a state representative. I said, I can't believe this. You know, there's 50,000 people that live in the district, and not one person on my side of the political aisle wants to run for that office. And so I ended up meeting with that party chair, had a conversation with my family then that weekend, because the deadline to file was the following Tuesday. And my family knew that this was something that I'd always wanted to do. It was
right.
like a goal that I always had of possibly serving in the state legislature in Lansing. And so I took a run at it. It was going up against an incumbent and lost. But again, it was a great learning experience because I got to meet all kinds of people in the county that encouraged me. And as a result of those conversations, somebody has suggested that, you know, if your goal is to get to Lansing, you really need to start at the local level. You know, be involved at the school board or your township board, that kind of thing. And so a year later, because of that being exposure running for state office, one of the local elected officials invited me to become part of a committee within the township. And so I served on this committee for a year with a number of other folks. The following spring, when it was time to get ready to file for local office, I was approached if I would run for clerk. I said, well, let me find out what a clerk does. And so when I found out what the statutory responsibilities were for a township clerk, I realized that it dovetailed very nicely with my background, my education, and my my nonprofit experience. And so I took the plunge and threw my hat in the ring, ended up being elected as clerk, was reelected the following term, and so it's kind of helped transition my career path, where after being involved in government for 12 years with my experiences as a manager at GM, a consultant in the world of quality engineering, I thought, maybe this is a good time for me to look at broadening my horizons, because I come from a rural community that does not have water and sewer. So we have a low population for a township, just under 6,000 people, and we're considered part-time officials. And until we have infrastructure in our backyard, there's really no compelling reason to change the dynamics of our political structure. And so I thought, if I'm going to continue to utilize my experience, maybe I ought to look at trying to be an assistant city manager or a village manager for a small community where I thought I could be a good fit. I like small towns. I grew up in Plymouth when Plymouth was still considered a small community.
Well, when Plymouth had one high school still downtown.
And I was the last graduating class of the original high school, right, before it broke up.
Before they brought the property.
Plymouth Salem and Plymouth Canton. And then my wife and I ended up living in downtown Northville for a number of years. Again, a small, quaint community. And so I just relished the opportunity here to be in a small, quaint village like Ortonville. You
mentioned running for state representative, and that was long before gerrymandering, or even Tim Resser calling it red and blue, because before then it was just you were an elected area. You ran because you were somewhat interested in being a public servant, so that certainly changed. But we'll be back and talk a little bit more about local politics and a little bit more about Mr. Trent's background, and we'll do that in about 60 seconds. My name is Greg Norman. We're talking with David Trent, who is the village manager for the village of Ortonville. It kind of gets wordy sometimes, so you got to remember it.
Yes, it does.
And it's Brandon Township Board, but it's the village council. So you've got to remember those, the sequitur in that discussion. Talk a little bit about your family.
Well, I've been married for 40 years now to my college sweetheart. I was very involved in sports in high school. Played basketball, baseball, ran cross country, and the opportunity opened up when I was at Schoolcraft College through one of my old teammates that was on the team, where they were looking for folks to help fill the roster because of some academic ineligibility of some of the guys
Right.
after the first term. And so I got on the basketball team, and lo and behold, there was this pretty blonde that was a cheerleader.
Oh, okay.
And one of those classic, boy meets girl on the basketball court.
Sure.
So we started dating and became sweethearts, and got married in our early 20s, and we've been married for 40 years now. I have 3 adult children. I have a daughter who is a clinical psychologist that
Wow.
now lives in the state of Virginia, in Williamsburg, so it's a great place to go and visit.
Absolutely.
Because I love American history.
Absolutely.
There's no better place to learn about American history than in colonial Williamsburg. And I've got 2 boys. Both are married, and we've got a grandchild that's on the way next February.
First
grandchild.
how's that settle? I say that because I have a 27-year-old son, and we're in that same neck of the woods.
Well, they're very excited. My wife is very excited because this is our first grandchild, and
No doubt.
she's been hoping for one for a couple years now, and so her wishes are coming true.
Were you aware of Ortonville prior to looking around at all?
I was not. When I saw the posting for the village manager position, I looked to find out where is Ortonville. I just said Oakland County, North Oakland County. I was a little familiar with Clarkston because one of my favorite restaurants in this vicinity is the Union Station.
Okay, sure.
Because of their mac and cheese.
Sure.
Years ago, you might recall, Greg, having been in the area for a long time, that there was a Wall Street Journal front page story about the recipe scandal between the Union Station and one of the restaurants down the street.
Yes.
And I always remembered that. And one day, after going to a Pistons game, I took my family to the Union Station just so that we could try this famous mac and cheese that I had read about in the Wall Street Journal. And fell in love with the restaurant, the ambiance, and of course the food. And so every time that I have the chance, when I'm in the Clarkston area, I stop at the Union Station.
What was the old Clarkston Inn, which is now, I can't remember the name of what's replaced it, but they own the Firehouse in Fenton. What's the restaurant in Clarkston? I can't think of the name. I'll remember it at some point. I'm looking off camera because I'm asking my camera behind the fact. I was with the New York Times in those days, so I actually remember the story being written and reading it out of, from another part of it. Hey, this is where we grew up, so I remember it very well. But so you found out we're here.
I found out where Ortonville is. I came to a village council meeting in August just to get familiar with the territory, see if it was something that I really wanted to pursue. And after attending the meeting, getting a feel for the dynamics and some of the challenges, as I was walking around the village, I actually happened to just walk into a business and made a comment about some of the water jugs I saw in the back of the shop. And because we have a similar situation in Salem Township where everybody's on well and septic. And so people do bring in, Absopure and other drinking water into their homes. And so I made a comment and discovered that this village of Ortonville and the surrounding area has similar challenges, if you will, with no water, no sewer. So everybody's on well and septic. Got an appreciation of the referendum that the community had last year on whether or not they wanted to invest in a bond proposal to bring a wastewater treatment plant and sewers to the community. And because of my background in Salem Township, having the same challenges for potential development in one area of our township that is right off of the M14 Expressway. And our zoning ordinance there requires that any development, because it's designed for higher density growth. So we don't want municipal wells, we don't want a wastewater treatment plant if we can avoid it. We want to bring water and sewer to that area. And so with my understanding of what we've been dealing with in Salem, the challenges that I see Ortonville faces,
Similar.
an advocate of going back to the well one more time and see if we can develop a regional approach to address that issue. And in my first month here in the village, I've been very warmly received, and the idea has been embraced by other community leaders that the approach that we took, partly because of external forces, partly because of the financing that was available at the time, essentially pigeonholed Ortonville into having to take the lead and take that task on by itself.
Right.
And I think in the last year there's been some dynamics that have occurred where now the township, with some of the subdivisions along the lakes, are crying out that, hey, we really need to look at bringing sewers into our neighborhoods, and also with some of the issues that the school district is facing, where the county is looking at requiring the school district to invest huge sums of money to fix their septic fields.
Right. The community's stuck in no man's land because you've got the history of the Detroit Water District that didn't quite get out this far. And you got the Flint obvious problems with Flint that they didn't get south far enough. So you've got this sort of no man's land. And I know I was in California for a long time, and I know we were involved in some things in northern San Diego County where sequence batch reacting sewage treatment was a way around having to worry about water. In California, you have water districts that have as much power and sometimes more power than local governments. Because without water, you can't build golf courses or subdivisions, or for that matter, even deal with farms, whether it be a vineyard or those kinds of things. So they found different ways around it. And having sat through 6 years of sequence batch reacting stories, I probably know as much about that process of wastewater management as most engineers do, just because you had to listen to the process. And I think looking for alternatives, especially with the Detroit water system having had its political history for the last 20 years not being exactly as good as it needs to be, and all the other communities north of it and west of it having difficulty. It's obviously a smart move to look at going to a regional basis or going to finding other alternatives.
And one of the challenges and some of the feedback, because in my early weeks here on the job, I've been trying to reach out to business owners, people that have had to invest large chunks of money in fixing their septic systems, and trying to get a pulse of, is it that people are against sewers, or is it they just don't want to be burdened with the financial issues that come with that large of an investment when you're talking $20 million plus or minus for putting in the infrastructure. What
did your own scientific research find?
Well, thus far, in the small sample size that I've been able to take, the feedback I'm getting is that people would embrace sewers if the cost could be made more palatable. And the only way that I can see that we can accomplish that is to reach out to our county, state, and federal officials and figure out a way that we can tap into grant monies or some sort of low interest financing. And those tools were evaluated in the past, but again, because it was done at the way things worked out, where it was strictly the village of Ortonville, that we really didn't have enough buy-in and users to help make the cost palatable.
It's been a pretty polarizing discussion. It's either you're for or against. There's not a lot of I don't knows, or I'm not sure, or I'm if you talk to at least the folks that we talked to, it was a very concrete answer when you would ask somebody. And do you think it is the biggest issue facing the village at the moment?
Initially, I think that is the biggest challenge. A lot of people are telling me that is, that the future of Ortonville and the surrounding area really hinges on, can we bring at least a sewer system into the community, because it really is hindering our flexibility on making the downtown area more vibrant than what it is today. Because of the county restrictions, we're very limited on restaurants being able to come in. So there's only certain types of businesses that can come into our community and hope to be successful.
Right. Which is one of the reasons sometimes our downtown occupancy, something that DDA spends a great deal of time worried about, is sometimes we have, the building we're in, we're a long-term serving community company, if you will, as part of the township and part of the village, but we're going to be here for a long time. But before we were here, there were 6 different companies. If you look up and down, just even what on this street, on this side, we have a vacant building next to us that used to be a jewelry store for a long time. The building next door in the 5 years we've been here has had 3 different businesses. So unfortunately, without that support, it becomes an issue. But have you thought about a time frame? Are you looking at, I know it's not months, obviously, but is it years or is it decades?
Well, my goal, and this might be very optimistic at this stage without getting my arms around the whole issue, but I've had some initial discussions with people in the county. I've got meetings queued up in the next week with state and federal officials. And with the recent election and the new president-elect who is trumpeting, that's not to try to be a pun, but there has been a lot of talk about investing in infrastructure, and I think this might be hopefully the stars and the planets getting aligned at the right time to be able to reach out and possibly take advantage of some special appropriations that may get enacted that would make it possible for small communities like us to be able to tap into new appropriations and earmarks that we could utilize in investing in sewer and essentially hopefully bring the cost down, where if people did have to hook in or had the option to hook in, and that's one of the other things that has been shared with me too, is that a lot of people have already had to spend tens of thousands of dollars to replace their septic system, put in an engineered field. And so the idea of now, I've already done this in the last couple of years, and I'm already compliant with county, waste management practices.
Why spend more money?
Well, yeah, why should I have to shell out another $20,000 or $25,000 over the next 20 to 40 years?
Right.
So if I have the option to hook in if my system fails, that's what I would prefer to have. And if that's really the case, and if there's a limited number of users that we can tap into depending on where the system is located and how it's designed, obviously we want to get the M15 commercial corridor involved. We want to get buy-in from the school district and have as many people within the village tie into it. But if we can get a lot of money from the state and federal government to help us out with this, perhaps we can make it so that whatever the bottom line is that our citizens would have to invest in makes it something that they can say, hey, I can now buy into this. And I'm hoping to accomplish that, Greg, within the next 2 years.
Okay, that's a very ambitious time frame. Has anybody looked, and I don't know if they have in their research on the last election, last proposal, has anybody looked at SEMCOG data as far as where populations are going and how things mix, and does that add to an asset if you're looking at talking with state and federal officials? SEMCOG says, okay, SEMCOG's been pretty good. I should say the Southeastern Michigan Council of Governments, which does a lot of pre-planning. In fact, that's probably what their primary goal is. And if you look at SEMCOG, they're pretty accurate if you go back even 15 or 20 years about what's happening now. And I would wonder if anybody looked at the SEMCOG numbers and facts to figure out where that fits, and it may give you a sign that there's going to be population here that matters in terms of volume, or not. And I just wonder if anybody's even considered that.
To be honest with you, I don't know if that's been examined yet. With your indication that maybe we should look at that, I plan to look at that. But with what happened in the state of Michigan with the economy taking a big downturn in the mid-2000s, the numbers that they were projecting, even for my home township in Salem, are way off the mark. And part of that is because the economy turned.
Right.
Partly because growth that was anticipated, where, let's say, the water and sewer was expected to come out to our backyard and it hasn't. So our population has stayed relatively flat with just some minimal increase over the last couple of years because the economy has turned around. People have bought parcels and they're building some new homes in our township. But they were looking at potentially by 2025, 2030, that and Salem Township, which at the time was just a little over 5,000 people, was going to grow to potentially 20,000 people.
It didn't.
And it hasn't. You know,
Yeah.
we've stayed very, relatively flat. And with the village of Ortonville, essentially being pretty well built out, the only growth in the area is going to come through the township. And I know there's a lot of vacant land and so on, but, essentially, because of the soil composition, the water table, et cetera, I think the growth is probably going to be pretty static or limited unless we do have infrastructure that comes to the area.
Well, I asked the question because on CNN this morning, Mitch McConnell was on talking about the $1 trillion investment that Mr. Trump wants to put into infrastructure, and he said that was a Trump priority and it wasn't a necessarily Senate or congressional priority. And he said it dropped from 2 to 7 or 8 or 9. And he also mentioned that term limits, which is something Mr. Trump wants to consider, is not even on the table. And unfortunately, Mr. Trump can have all the, hope in the world, but if he doesn't have some help from his speaker, then that's, and the majority leader from that perspective. But the other issue I'm asking about is that transportation has something to do with it, because if you look at Oxford, where you have a 5-lane highway coming all the way to the pier, unlike the 2-lane road at M15, Oxford's going like by leaps and bounds. And the school projections are that the classes that are coming in and graduating from the 5th grade up are actually getting larger every year for the next 10 years. Brandon is the opposite, and we are literally 10 miles apart. And part of that goes back to the transportation corridor that we have or don't have, water have or not have. And so part of that goes back to exactly what you're suggesting, is that water is power, and with it you can do a lot of things. And as adequate as, and I say adequate as septic tanks are, they're not sewers. And it does make a difference, because there are still, I bet you if you did the old dye test as they used to do around this area to see if anything leached, I bet you'd find still some of those things, because there's no way the county has covered every septic tank in every part of this county. It's impossible. And if they have, then I apologize. But I think it's to me, sewers are 1A, and 2 in terms of the priority list. So I commend you for at least grabbing that bull by the horn and trying to ride with it with a short time frame.
It's funny you mentioned, Greg, about the septic systems that are failing. I participated in a webinar yesterday that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality sponsored that dealt with septic systems and understanding them. And their analysis is that approximately 10% of all the septic systems in the state of Michigan are probably failing.
Yeah.
And of course, that's just a projection on their part. But one of the things I found interesting through that seminar was that Michigan has the largest number of septic systems in the Great Lakes area, with 1.4 million septic fields. And they're approximating that 130,000 of them have some level of failure. And so, short of us being able to tap into a sewer system, and even the federal government has done a turnaround, because back 30, 50, 60 years ago, the mentality was that at some point the sewers are going to come to you. And with the high cost of bringing sewer to the areas that we do have, the reality is that maybe we need to reevaluate how we can better manage our septic systems, because it looks like they're going to be around for a while, because it's not practical from an investment standpoint to bring sewers to everybody.
I don't remember when this was, and it was a while ago, it may have been 10 years, but somebody either from the Michigan Township Association or from SEMCOG rated elected positions in communities by their importance based on 2 factors, based on the amount of people they affected and based on the numbers of dollars that they affected within that job. It turned out that drain commissioner was the 3rd most important job in that ranking of mayors and trustees and clerks and treasurers, and turns out that the drain commissioner was the 3rd most important, because we all know that water runs, or as they say, some things run downhill. And with us in this area being the way it is, one of the biggest problems with septic tanks, it has been forever in this area, because of the lead content in the water, is that soap that we use in washing machines is what ends up making most septic systems fail. It's not the normal things you would think of. It just happens to be the soap factor. It builds, it clogs, and if you have no place else to go, it's a septic tank. It leaches, as they were. It spills over. And so that's kind of an interesting, but I always found that interesting that the drain commissioner was more important in Oakland County, even at the county level, that might have been the treasurer, because you're worried about your money, but if you know, so I thought I always found that interesting.
Speaking of leaching or failing fields, one of the things that the village council just recently did is that we have contracted with a consultant to do an analysis of the village's septic fields by age, doing an analysis of how many permits have been taken out in the last several years, so that we can get a better grasp of how serious of a situation do we have. You know, I think there's a broad brushed concern that we do have a problem. We're going to try to get our arms around just how big of a problem do we currently have today based on the age of fields. One of the things I found out in the seminar that was very interesting is that up until the early 70s, you didn't even have to get a permit. So
That's right.
Now you've got the concern that got generated in my mind is that in a community that is as old, if you will, as our community, is how many old systems are out there that have either failed in the past, and people have tried to jerry-rig, if you will, their system to keep it functioning.
Right.
Versus the fact that since the early 70s, you've been required to get a permit.
Well, the other double part of this, and I only know this being an old newspaper editor who started in a small town of Fenton when I was 16 or 17. A lot of houses built around lakes, and we have, Lord knows, we have tons of them in the northern part of the county. Instead of building footings that were 42 inches deep and 12 inches wide, a lot of them built floating foundations, which were 42 wide and 12 deep to support the weight of the house because the ground didn't percolate like it might have. Well, doing that, you're able to sort of shallow out your septic tank because of the depth of the water table. Well, those were the worst kind because those were the closest to the surface. And it wasn't anything unusual. I grew up on a house like this. We were on a lake. It wasn't anything unusual. And after big rains to see, say remnants from the septic tank because it just came through the ground. And we didn't think much about it. We waited until it stopped raining and let the grass dry and then just run over it with a tractor. Well, that's not exactly EPA standards by any stretch of the imagination. And you hope like heck it never happened on Friday because Saturday and Sunday when you had company coming out, there was a certain stench when you're parking your car in the back of the house. So you had to be a little careful with where that came to. But it's been a fascinating conversation about sewers and septic tanks. But I guess in our time frame, I got a couple questions left. Tell me what we can expect from you as a village manager.
Well, with the skill sets and the knowledge that I bring to the table, my number one goal is to work hand in hand with our village council in identifying the major priorities for our community and working with the community leaders and the citizens to try to implement those policies and procedures. As the role of the village manager, I have the day-to-day responsibilities for our office staff with our treasurer, clerk, interfacing with our building official, as well as our DDA, executive director. So I'm looking forward to those opportunities to interface with all of the staff and with our village council elected officials and make Hortonville a great place to live.
What's your strength?
My major strength is interfacing with people, trying to listen, communicate, and essentially develop a vision. I'm a visionary. Big goals, to try to accomplish something within 2 years that just went down the tubes last year. Some people said, you're really jumping into the frying pan maybe a little too early. And I said, well, I think, if we look at it from a regional approach, that's our best opportunity to be successful. And so I'm willing to take that risk, stick my neck out, and thus far, people have been very encouraging of taking that approach. Looking forward in the very near future to being able to sit down with the township supervisor, Kathy Thurman, Dr. Outlaw from the school district, and put our heads together as how we can work together to make this a reality. And with some of the dynamics that we've already talked about with the federal government, the discussion about investing in infrastructure, if we take a regional approach, grants and those kinds of things are looked at much more favorably when you have multiple
Right.
entities involved in the process and not just one locale.
Right.
And I think that may work to our benefit
Well,
going forward.
one can fail, and you've got 7, 8, 10 others. You put everything in one basket. I mean, that's just obvious. You know, if it fails, you're out the door. And that's kind of what happened, unfortunately. My last question, I'm going to save it for the next time we have a chance to interview. Is my question is, what would we be surprised about? But I'm going to say that for the next time, because I have a feeling we're going to have a conversation here in the next couple of months anyway. So I want to thank you for coming and appreciate the insight. David Trent, who is the village manager for the village of Mortonville. And my name is Greg Norman, and for all the guys in the back, we'll see you next time.